beneath the marble floors and echoing corridors of Vatican City lies a world few have ever seen. Beyond guarded doors and coded locks, the Vatican Apostolic Archive stretches for miles, a labyrinth of shelves packed with parchment, ink, and secrets. Here, history is not displayed, but hidden, preserved in silence rather than celebrated. Scholars speak of the archive in hushed tones, as if the documents themselves might be listening. To enter this place is not simply to read the past, but to confront it. Access is tightly controlled, permissions narrowly defined, and entire collections remain sealed without explanation. Some files are restricted for decades, others for centuries. Yet historians whisper of something far more unusual, a record locked away with no expiration at all. According to scattered testimonies and rare admissions, one file tied to the Knights Templar was never scheduled for release. Not after 100 years, not after 500. It was marked as permanent silence, no catalog description, no public reference, just a quiet decision made long ago that certain truths were too volatile to survive exposure. What kind of document earns that fate, a confession, an absolution, or evidence so destabilizing that revealing it would fracture carefully maintained narratives? The deeper researchers dig, the clearer it becomes that the archive is not merely a storage room for history, but a control room for it. And somewhere in that underground maze, behind doors that almost no one opens, the Knights Templar are usually remembered as armored figures on horseback, relics of crusading wars long ended. But within the Vatican, their name carries a different weight. It is not nostalgia, but discomfort. Not legend, but an unresolved problem the Church never truly buried. More than 7 centuries after their destruction, the Templars still provoke hesitation. Requests for documents stall. Conversations abruptly change direction. Even seasoned historians notice a subtle tension when the order is mentioned. This reaction is strange, considering the official story claims the matter was settled in the 14th century. The reason lies in what the Templars represented. They were not merely soldiers, but an institution operating beyond normal control. Answering directly to the Pope, wealthier than monarchs and embedded across Europe, they blurred the line between sacred authority and independent power. When they fell, their erasure was meant to be total. Yet the name survived, not in triumph, but in fear, because the Templars were not condemned as clearly as history suggests. They were dissolved without a definitive verdict, leaving a legal and moral stain the Church never fully resolved. To acknowledge this uncertainty would be to admit that one of history's most infamous purges may have been unjust. And so the name persists like a ghost, lingering in the archive corridors, reminding the Church of a chapter it cannot comfortably explain. Even today, silence feels safer than confronting what truly happened inside those locked halls. In the early years of the 21st century, a Vatican researcher paging through mislabeled folders noticed an anomaly. A parchment, thin and faded, had been filed among unrelated correspondence, as if it were meant to be overlooked. Its seal was damaged, its margins cramped with hurried Latin, but its date was unmistakable, placing it at the very heart of the Templar trials. As the text was translated, the implications became unsettling. The document recorded a private inquiry conducted on behalf of the Pope, one that reached conclusions never reflected in public decrees. It spoke not of heresy confirmed, but of reconciliation granted, of absolution quietly issued to men already condemned in the streets. For historians, this was not a minor correction, it was a reversal. If authentic, it meant the Church had known the Templars were not guilty of the crimes used to destroy them. The executions, the dissolutions, the confiscations would no longer appear as tragic mistakes, but as deliberate choices made despite the truth. The question then became unavoidable. If this parchment existed all along, why was it buried? Why allow centuries of accusation to stand unchallenged? Some scholars argue it was political necessity. Others suggest institutional self-preservation. Either way, the discovery shattered the comforting belief that history's silence was accidental. It hinted instead at a carefully maintained lie, preserved page by page behind locked doors, and the archives kept their answers sealed, waiting for someone to notice. Why would an institution built on doctrine and record-keeping choose silence over clarity? That question sits at the heart of the Knights Templar mystery. For 700 years, their story remained deliberately unresolved, suspended between guilt and innocence, as if certainty itself posed a threat. If the Templars were truly heretics, the evidence should have been displayed, preserved as proof of righteous judgment. Heresy trials were meant to warn others, not vanish into obscurity. Yet crucial records were hidden, misfiled, or sealed without explanation. That alone suggests discomfort, not confidence. But the alternative is even more troubling. If the Templars were innocent, then exposing the truth would reveal something damaging than a medieval injustice. It would show that the Church knowingly sacrificed an entire order to satisfy political pressure, royal debt, and the balance of power. Such an admission would undermine the idea of moral authority itself. There is also another possibility whispered among historians, that the danger was not legal, but ideological, that the Templars possessed knowledge, testimony, or revelations that challenged accepted narratives of faith and history. If such material existed, burying it would have been an act of survival. And so the story was sealed not because it was finished, but because it was unresolved. Silence became the solution. The archive doors closed, centuries passed, and the unanswered questions hardened into legend. Yet buried truths have a way of resurfacing, especially when someone dares to ask why history chose to forget instead of explain everything forever. The world that gave birth to the Knights Templar was one of fear, faith, and constant bloodshed. In the aftermath of the First Crusade, Jerusalem was reclaimed, but the roads leading to it were death traps. Pilgrims traveled thousands of miles only to be robbed, enslaved, or murdered within sight of holy walls. It was in this chaos that a small group of knights took vows that blurred the line between monk and soldier. They swore to live in poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet pledged their lives to violence in defense of others. This contradiction shocked medieval society. Warriors were meant to fight, monks were meant to pray. The Templars claimed they would do both, guided by divine purpose rather than personal glory. At first, they were few, poorly equipped, and housed near the ruins of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. No one expected them to last, but something about their discipline, secrecy, and absolute unity set them apart from other crusading orders. They moved with precision, spoke little, and answered questions vaguely. What began as protection soon became presence. They were always there, watching roads, guarding passes, surviving encounters that destroyed larger forces. Some said they were favored by God. Others sensed something colder, more deliberate. From their very first steps, the Templars felt less like a spontaneous brotherhood and more like an order built for a purpose not yet revealed. History would later suggest their origin story was only the surface of something far deeper and darker truths. On paper, the Knights Templar owned nothing. Each knight renounced personal wealth, swearing to live as a servant of God. Yet across Europe, kings borrowed from them, nobles entrusted fortunes to them, and entire economies quietly revolved around their system. This contradiction baffled contemporaries and still confuses historians today. The Templars perfected something revolutionary. Pilgrims could deposit money in one country and withdraw it safely in another using coded documents. In a violent medieval world, this made the order indispensable. Castles, farmland, ships, and treasuries accumulated under their management, even if no single knight could claim ownership. Over time, their network spanned continents. They financed wars, funded monarchs, and influenced trade routes without ruling any land themselves. This invisible power was far more threatening than armies. It operated silently, efficiently, and beyond traditional oversight. What troubled rulers was not just the wealth, but its independence. The Templars answered to no crown, paid no taxes, and revealed no full accounting. Their books were closed, their methods guarded. To debt-ridden kings, this looked less like piety and more like defiance. How a group sworn to poverty became untouchable bankers remains one of history's great ironies. Some see divine favor, others see calculated genius. Either way, the imbalance of power was unsustainable, and resentment quietly grew, waiting for an excuse to strike. That excuse would arrive suddenly, reshaping Europe, rewriting history, and turning financial brilliance into the very weapon used against them by those who feared losing control forever and authority itself. Beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the Knights Templar were granted quarters of immense symbolic importance. They lived atop ruins, believed to house the remains of Solomon's Temple, one of the most sacred and mysterious sites in history. What they did there remains officially undocumented. Chroniclers mention excavation tools, extended stays underground, and restricted access to certain chambers. Yet no inventory survives. No report details what was found, if anything. This absence is precisely what fuels speculation. In an age obsessed with record-keeping, silence is rarely accidental. Some believe the Templars uncovered ancient relics, lost scriptures, or forgotten knowledge predating Christianity. Others argue they found nothing at all, and the legends emerged later. But the order's sudden rise in influence after their time on the Mount raises uncomfortable questions. If their power was purely military, why focus so intensely on a buried past? Why guard the site so closely? The Church never clarified, and the Templars never spoke. Whatever lay beneath those stones either vanished with them or was hidden beyond recovery. The Temple Mount became the Order's silent origin point, a place where faith, archaeology, and secrecy collided. And in the absence of answers, mystery filled the void, growing larger with every unanswered question. That unanswered beginning would echo through centuries, shaping legends, conspiracies, and the belief that the Templars guarded something never meant to be rediscovered by ordinary history, and perhaps protected it from forces within the Church itself, long after their destruction and disappearance, forever recorded. From its earliest days, the Knights Templar existed outside normal medieval authority. They did not answer to kings, local bishops, or feudal law. Their allegiance was solely to the Pope, granting them privileges unmatched by any other order. This protection allowed them to move freely across borders and ignore commands that constrained others. In theory, this arrangement served the Church, a loyal, mobile force directly under papal control was a powerful asset. In practice, it created an organization that operated beyond accountability. The Templars collected taxes, built fortresses, and enforced their own discipline without interference. As their influence expanded, rulers grew uneasy. An armed, wealthy order immune to secular law challenged the foundations of monarchy. Even bishops resented their exemptions. Complaints accumulated, but no one could touch them as long as papal favor remained intact. This unique status fostered arrogance in the eyes of critics and confidence within the order. The Templars believed their mission was divinely sanctioned and therefore unquestionable. That belief hardened them against compromise. When political winds shifted, their independence became a liability. The same privilege that protected them isolated them. Once papal support wavered, the order stood alone, surrounded by enemies who had waited patiently for the moment authority would no longer shield them. The fall, when it came, was sudden and devastating, proving that divine authority offers little protection when politics decide an institution has become too powerful to tolerate in any era, including one ruled by faith, fear, ambition, and calculated betrayal alone endured. As the power of the Knights Templar grew, so did the rumors that followed them like shadows. In taverns, courts, and cloisters, whispers began to circulate about what truly happened behind the closed doors of their chapter houses. Initiation rituals, it was said, were not what they appeared to be. New recruits allegedly swore oaths in darkness, spoke forbidden words, and were exposed to symbols no outsider was meant to see. In an age deeply afraid of heresy, secrecy itself was suspicious. The Templar silence only fed speculation. Critics claimed they rejected Christ during ceremonies, spat on the cross, or practiced rituals borrowed from unknown traditions. None of these accusations were proven at the time, yet they persisted, growing more elaborate with each retelling. What makes these rumors unsettling is not their strangeness, but their consistency. Similar claims surfaced independently across regions, suggesting either a coordinated smear or a shared observation distorted by fear. The Church officially dismissed many of these stories for years, which raises another question. Why did such dangerous rumors circulate without immediate suppression? Some historians believe these whispers were deliberate seeds planted by enemies. Others argue they were fragments of misunderstood practices, stripped of context and weaponized. Whether lies or echoes of something real, the rumors reshaped how the Templars were perceived. Once doubt took root, truth became irrelevant. In medieval Europe, suspicion alone was often enough to destroy even the most powerful, and the whispers were only getting louder. Among all accusations leveled against the Knights Templar, none proved more enduring than the claim they worshipped an idol known as Baphomet. The name itself appears suddenly in trial records spoken under torture, never clearly defined. Some described a head with many faces. Others spoke of a bearded figure or something metallic and unnatural. No two descriptions ever fully matched. What is striking is that no physical evidence was ever produced. No idol was displayed, no relic presented. Yet the charge was repeated until it hardened into fact. Baphomet became a symbol of corruption, a convenient embodiment of everything the Church feared and could not explain. Centuries later, the name resurfaced in occult writings, far removed from medieval trials. Occultists, artists, and secret societies adopted Baphomet as a symbol of forbidden knowledge and balance, retroactively linking it to the Templars. This evolution complicates the narrative. Did the symbol originate with the order, or was it invented to condemn them and later reimagined? Some scholars suggest Baphomet was a corrupted word, possibly derived from misunderstood languages or accusations forced under pain. Others believe it represented something symbolic rather than literal. Whatever its origin, Baphomet became the perfect accusation. It required no proof, only fear. And fear, once unleashed, proved far more powerful than truth in shaping the fate of the Knights Templar, forever remembered. Beyond accusations of heresy lay a more dangerous idea, that the Knights Templar had discovered knowledge beyond the Church's authority. During their time in the East, they encountered cultures far older than medieval Europe. Repositories of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy preserved for centuries. Exposure to this learning alone could unsettle rigid doctrine. Some believe the Templars collected ancient texts, fragments of forgotten histories, or interpretations of scripture that challenged official theology. If such knowledge existed, it would threaten the Church's role as sole interpreter of divine truth. Control of belief depended on control of information. There is no surviving inventory of what the Templars learned or preserved. That absence is telling. Orders less controversial left detailed records. The Templars did not. Their silence may have been protection, not secrecy for secrecy's sake. Critics argue these theories romanticize the order, yet the Church's reaction suggests genuine concern. Suppressing ideas has always been easier than disproving them. If the Templars possessed alternative interpretations of faith or evidence contradicting sacred narratives, elimination would be the simplest solution. Knowledge has always been more dangerous than weapons. Armies can be defeated, but ideas linger. If the Templars carried truths that could not be erased, destroying the order may have been the only way to contain them, ensuring that authority remained unquestioned and the official story unchallenged for centuries afterward, buried beneath fear and institutional silence. History reveals a recurring pattern. Those who push beyond accepted boundaries often face swift and brutal consequences. From philosophers to scientists, curiosity has repeatedly been labeled heresy when it threatens established power. The Knights Templar may have followed this same path, stepping unknowingly into forbidden territory. Their curiosity is not reckless, but institutional. As an order, they traveled widely, gathered intelligence, and interacted with scholars of many traditions. This openness, while practical, made them vulnerable. They knew too much, and worse, they knew it collectively. Once suspicion formed, curiosity became guilt. The idea that they possessed hidden knowledge transformed them from protectors of pilgrims into perceived threats. Accusations no longer needed proof, only plausibility. In a climate of fear, imagination filled the gaps where evidence was absent. The trials that followed reflected this shift. Confessions extracted under torture echoed the rumors, not because they were true, but because the narrative was already written. Curiosity had crossed an invisible line, and the punishment was predetermined. The destruction of the Templars served as a warning. Knowledge outside sanctioned boundaries would not be tolerated. Silence was enforced not just on the order, but on the ideas they might have carried. And so, curiosity ended not in discovery, but in fire, ensuring that whatever the Templars truly knew died with them or vanished into archives never meant to be fully opened again. By the early 14th century, King Philip IV of France ruled an ambitious but financially strained kingdom. Wars, court extravagance, and administrative reforms had drained the royal treasury dry. Traditional sources of revenue were no longer enough, and Philip had already clashed with bankers, merchants, and even the papacy over money. Yet one creditor stood above all others in both wealth and independence: the Knights Templar. The Templars did not merely lend Philip money, they safeguarded royal funds, managed accounts, and acted as financial intermediaries for the crown. In effect, the king's solvency depended on an order he could not control. This imbalance gnawed at him. A monarch indebted to warrior monks was not just inconvenient, it was humiliating. Gradually, financial pressure turned into resentment. Eliminating the Templars would not only erase Philip's debts, it would transfer their immense assets into royal hands. Suddenly, accusations that once seemed implausible became useful. Moral outrage aligned perfectly with political need. Philip framed his actions as righteous justice. But timing reveals another motive. The campaign against the Templars began when repayment was impossible and desperation peaked. Their destruction offered a solution too perfect to ignore. Debt alone does not explain betrayal, but it provides the spark. Once the idea took hold, the king moved decisively. What followed would be presented as divine judgment, but its origins lay firmly in empty coffers, wounded pride, and the ruthless logic of power disguised as faith and justice before the world. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the illusion shattered. Across France, royal agents moved with chilling precision. Templar commanderies were surrounded. Doors were forced open. Knights were seized in their beds and chapels in complete disbelief. By nightfall, hundreds were imprisoned without warning. Such coordination was unprecedented. Communication in the medieval world was slow and unreliable, yet the arrests unfolded almost simultaneously. This was no spontaneous reaction. It was the result of months, perhaps years, of secret planning. Orders had been drafted, sealed, and distributed in advance, their contents hidden until the final moment. The shock rippled across Europe. The Templars had been untouchable for generations. Their sudden fall sent a clear message that no protection was absolute. If they could be arrested overnight, anyone could. The most disturbing question was not what happened, but how. Only the highest authority could authorize such a sweeping action. The scale suggested cooperation beyond the crown, or at least the expectation of compliance. Philip had acted first, forcing the church to respond rather than decide. By the time questions were asked, the damage was done. The Templars were prisoners, their reputations stained before any trial began. The arrests themselves became evidence, shaping public perception long before truth had any chance to surface in history's unfolding. Once imprisoned, the Knights Templar were subjected to interrogations designed to break bodies before uncovering truth. Torture was not an aberration, but a method. Pain became the language through which answers were demanded, regardless of reality. Under such conditions, confession was inevitable. Knights admitted to heresy, idol worship, blasphemy, and secret rituals, often contradicting one another. Some confessed, recanted, then confessed again as torture resumed. These words were recorded as proof, though they followed a predictable pattern shaped by the questions asked. Historians struggle with these testimonies. Confessions extracted under agony reveal more about the interrogators than the accused. When freedom or even death seems preferable to suffering, truth dissolves. Survival becomes the only goal. Yet these confessions were paraded as validation. They transformed rumors into official charges. Once written, they justified further arrests, harsher methods, and public condemnation. The tragedy lies not only in the pain inflicted, but in how easily coerced words replaced evidence. The narrative was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about confirmation. The trials ceased to seek truth and instead manufactured it, one confession at a time. until doubt itself became heresy and silence was the only remaining defense against unbearable torment. As the arrests unfolded, all eyes turned to Pope Clement IV. As head of the Church and protector of the Templars, his response should have been swift and decisive. Instead, there was hesitation. Letters were delayed. Statements avoided clarity. Silence filled the gap where authority was expected. Clement found himself trapped between duty and survival. To openly defend the Templars risked confrontation with a powerful king who had already demonstrated his willingness to act without permission. To condemn them outright required evidence he did not yet possess. This paralysis spoke volumes. Silence was interpreted as consent. Philip pressed forward, shaping events faster than the papacy could react. By the time Clement intervened, the narrative had hardened. Some see the Pope's delay as caution, others see fear. The papacy itself had recently been weakened, relocated, and politically vulnerable. Challenging Philip could have destabilized the Church. In choosing silence, Clement preserved short-term stability at the cost of justice. His inaction allowed momentum to carry the Templars toward destruction. History would remember his hesitation not as wisdom, but as complicity, sealing the fate of an order abandoned at the moment it needed its highest protector most. While truth waited helplessly behind locked doors and unanswered prayers, forever unheard. The proceedings against the Knights Templar were called trials, but they resembled performances more than judicial inquiries. From the beginning, normal legal protections dissolved. Accused knights were denied proper defense, denied access to full charges, and often denied the chance to speak freely. The machinery of justice moved, but its destination seemed fixed in advance. Rules shifted depending on convenience. Confessions obtained under torture were accepted, while retractions were ignored. Testimony that favored the Templars was dismissed as unreliable, even when delivered voluntarily. In some regions, secular courts overstepped their authority, judging matters of faith, normally reserved for the Church. This improvisation revealed a deeper truth. The goal was not to discover guilt, but to legitimize a decision already made. Legal formality became a tool, not a safeguard. By dressing punishment in procedure, authorities could claim righteousness while avoiding accountability. For observers at the time, the process felt wrong. Even by medieval standards, the lack of consistency was alarming, but objections were dangerous. To question the trial was to risk being associated with the accused. Justice requires uncertainty, the willingness to be proven wrong. In the Templar case, uncertainty was treated as an obstacle. The law bent until it aligned with power, leaving behind a hollow imitation of fairness that would haunt the Church's conscience long after the final verdicts were pronounced. As historians sift through surviving records, they encounter silence where clarity should exist. Key documents referenced during the trials no longer exist. Letters are mentioned, then vanish. Reports are summarized, but originals are gone. This absence is not random. It follows a pattern. Witnesses who initially defended the Templars later recanted under pressure, then disappeared from records altogether. Some were imprisoned, others were silenced through reassignment or exile. Their voices faded, leaving only accusations to echo. Even physical evidence is conspicuously lacking. No idols, no artifacts, no ritual objects were ever produced. Instead, the case relied almost entirely on words spoken under duress. In any fair system, such gaps would collapse the prosecution. Here they were ignored. The missing pieces raise uncomfortable questions. Were documents destroyed to prevent contradiction? Were witnesses removed because they complicated the narrative, or were records deliberately fragmented to ensure ambiguity? What survives is selective, enough to condemn, not enough to explain. This imbalance forces historians to read between the lines, where absence itself becomes testimony. Sometimes what is missing tells a more honest story than what remains, suggesting not incompetence, but intention, a deliberate thinning of the record until only one conclusion was possible, regardless of what the truth might have revealed behind the scenes. Pope Clement V faced forces he could not openly resist. Letters exchanged between the papacy and the French crown reveal a steady escalation of pressure. Philip demanded action, threatened consequences, and framed his demands as protection of the faith. Clement attempted delay. He ordered his own inquiries, sought private confessions, and explored compromise. But each pause was met with renewed aggression. The king had already arrested the Templars. Public opinion was turning. To reverse course would require a confrontation the papacy was ill-equipped to survive. The Church's authority depended on appearing unified and decisive. Admitting error would expose weakness. Clement's position became impossible. Defend the Templars and risk political collapse, or sacrifice them to preserve institutional stability. This was not simply cowardice. It was calculation under duress. But calculation still carries moral weight. By yielding, Clement allowed political necessity to override spiritual responsibility. The papacy emerged intact, but diminished. Its moral authority suffered a fracture that never fully healed. The Templars paid the price for that survival, and the letters remain quiet witnesses to a moment when the Church chose endurance over justice, revealing how power can corner even those meant to stand above it. When the final decision arrived, it was strangely incomplete. The Knights Templar were dissolved as an order, stripped of property and identity. Yet they were never formally convicted of heresy by the Church. No definitive judgment was issued, no clear guilt declared. This legal limbo is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. If the evidence were overwhelming, condemnation would have been simple. Instead, the Church chose suppression without conclusion. The order was erased administratively, not destroyed judicially. Such an outcome satisfied political demands while avoiding a permanent theological stance. It closed the chapter without writing an ending, but unanswered. Questions do not disappear. They linger. The dissolution allowed the Church to move forward without admitting error or asserting innocence. It was a solution designed to end conflict, not uncover truth. For historians, this ambiguity is haunting. Why refuse to finalize the verdict? Why leave the matter unresolved? The implication is unsettling, that those in power knew the truth was inconvenient, that certainty in either direction carried unacceptable consequences. And so the Templars vanished into history, not as proven heretics, but as unresolved victims of a trial that never truly took place, leaving behind a silence that still echoes through the archives and demands explanation centuries later. Deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archive, among thousands of miscatalogued documents, a single parchment lay unnoticed for centuries. It was not dramatic in appearance. Faded ink, formal Latin, and official seal barely intact. Yet its contents carried the power to upend one of history's darkest verdicts. This document, later known as the Chinon Parchment, recorded a secret papal inquiry conducted at the height of the Templar crisis. According to its text, Pope Clement I authorized a private absolution of the Knights Templar's leaders. After questioning them directly, the papal representatives concluded that while the order may have committed procedural errors, They were not guilty of heresy. They were reconciled with the church, forgiven in private, and restored spiritually. This revelation was staggering. For centuries, the narrative held that the church condemned the Templars as heretics. Yet here was proof that the Pope himself reached the opposite conclusion. The executions, the imprisonment, the dissolution of the order all occurred despite this absolution. The parchment revealed a church divided against itself. Publicly, it allowed the persecution to continue. Privately, it acknowledged innocence. The contradiction was not accidental. It was documented. What made the Chinon Parchment even more disturbing was its silence afterward. No public announcement followed, no correction of the record. The document was filed away and forgotten, while the world continued to believe the Templars died condemned. In that quiet betrayal, history took shape. The parchment survived, but the truth it carried was locked behind archive doors, waiting centuries for discovery. Long after the men it could have saved were reduced to ash and memory alone. The existence of the Chinon Parchment raises a question more unsettling than the persecution itself. If the Pope absolved the Templars, why hide the proof? The answer lies not in theology, but in power. Admitting the truth would have exposed the Church's inability to protect its own order from political force. By the time absolution was granted, King Philip had already seized the initiative. The arrests were public. Confessions had been extracted. Retracting the accusations would have humiliated the papacy and challenged royal authority. Worse, it would have revealed that the Church bowed to pressure rather than justice. Preserving legitimacy required silence. To acknowledge innocence would undermine centuries of moral authority built on the idea that church judgments were divinely guided. The easier path was omission. Let the world believe the verdict was righteous even if it was not. There was also the issue of precedent. If the church admitted error in the Templar case, how many other judgments might be questioned? Heresy trials, excommunications, political alliances all depended on the perception of infallibility. So the parchment was hidden, not destroyed, but buried. It was preserved as a secret compromise, a private truth never meant to interfere with public narrative. The Church chose stability over transparency, continuity over correction. In doing so, it ensured the survival of the institution, but at the cost of truth. The Chinon Parchment became a symbol of that decision, proof that innocence alone was not enough to save the Templars, and that truth, when inconvenient, could be locked away indefinitely. When the Chinon Parchment was finally studied by modern historians, the reaction was immediate disbelief. Generations of scholarship had been built on the assumption that the Church condemned the Templars. Suddenly, that foundation cracked. One document forced centuries of narrative into question. Experts struggled to reconcile the contradiction. How could absolution coexist with execution? How could forgiveness be granted privately while punishment unfolded publicly? The answers were uncomfortable, pointing toward political manipulation rather than theological certainty. Some historians resisted the implications. Others embraced them cautiously. The parchment did not absolve the Church entirely, but it removed the illusion of clarity. The story was no longer simple. It was fractured, layered, and deeply human. Debate erupted over interpretation. Was absolution symbolic or genuine? Was Clement acting strategically or sincerely? Regardless, the document proved one thing beyond doubt. The official story was incomplete. What shocked scholars most was not the absolution itself, but how easily it had been forgotten. This was not a lost manuscript from a distant monastery. It was housed at the heart of the Vatican, overlooked for centuries. The discovery exposed the fragility of historical truth. How many other narratives depended on what had been hidden rather than what was known? The Chinon Parchment became a reminder that history is not merely written by victors, but curated by institutions, and sometimes quietly corrected long after the damage is irreversible. By the time the Chinon Parchment surfaced, the Knights Templar had been gone for nearly 700 years. Their leaders burned, their properties seized, their names stained beyond recovery. The truth arrived, but far too late to matter to those it concerned. This delay reveals the cruelest irony of the entire saga. The church possessed the power to intervene, to halt the executions, to correct the narrative. Instead, it chose delay, secrecy, and compromise. Justice was postponed until it became meaningless. The absolution, hidden and unused, exposes the trials for what they truly were. Not a search for truth, but a performance designed to satisfy political necessity. Once that purpose was served, the truth no longer mattered. For modern audiences, the revelation offers clarity but not closure. The Templars cannot be restored. Their fate cannot be undone. All that remains is the knowledge that history unfolded not because it was right, but because it was convenient. The Chinon Parchment stands as a final indictment, not of heresy, but of silence. It proves that innocence is powerless when truth is buried, and that institutions can survive by sacrificing justice. In the end, the revelation does not redeem the past. It exposes it, and in doing so, it leaves us with an unsettling realization that history's greatest injustices are not always committed in ignorance, but often with full knowledge, quietly sealed away, waiting centuries to be acknowledged. When the arrests began, royal officials expected to seize one of the greatest fortunes in medieval Europe. The Knights Templar owned estates, treasuries, fleets, and vast financial reserves. Yet when the dust settled, much of that wealth was simply gone. Records list properties transferred, but the liquid riches that made the order so powerful had vanished without trace. This disappearance baffled contemporaries and still troubles historians. The arrests were sudden, leaving little time for preparation. And yet, the Templar coffers were largely empty. Gold, silver, and financial instruments that should have been present were missing. There were no clear trails, no recovered hoards, no convincing explanation. Some argue the wealth was exaggerated, more reputation than reality, but surviving account books suggest otherwise. The Templars were sophisticated financiers. Their assets were real, distributed, and carefully managed. That level of organization makes their sudden absence even more suspicious. The most unsettling possibility is that the order anticipated its fall. The warnings were received, quietly acted upon, and never recorded. If so, the disappearance was not chaos, but design. Royal frustration was evident. Philip gained less than expected, undermining the financial motive behind the purge. This fuels speculation that the true treasure escaped confiscation entirely. To this day, no confirmed discovery has resolved the mystery. The missing fortune lingers in legend, not because of greed, but because its absence suggests intent. Something valuable was moved, hidden, or transformed, leaving behind only questions and the uneasy sense that the Templars were never as unprepared as history claims. As the official story tells it, the Knights Templar were crushed swiftly and completely. Yet legends tell a different story, one of sudden disappearances, empty castles, and ships that slipped quietly into the night. In some regions, arrests were delayed or incomplete. Entire groups of knights were never accounted for. Ports linked to the Templars reported missing vessels. Fortresses once heavily manned were found abandoned. These gaps fed rumors that escape routes had been prepared long in advance, that the Order, master of logistics and secrecy, had planned for betrayal. Medieval Europe was crisscrossed with Templar properties, connected by roads, rivers, and maritime routes. This network offered possibilities for rapid movement beyond royal reach. Remote strongholds, mountain fortresses, and coastal refuges provided cover for those who fled. Critics dismiss these stories as romantic exaggeration, but even skeptics admit the records are incomplete. Not every knight was captured. Not every house was searched. In the chaos, escape was possible. The persistence of these legends matters. They reflect a collective intuition that the story ended too neatly, that an organization so disciplined would not collapse without contingency. Whether large numbers escaped or only a few, the idea of vanishing knights challenges the narrative of total annihilation. It suggests survival, adaptation, and a chapter that history never fully documented, leaving the door open to possibilities far more unsettling than defeat. In the years following the Templars' dissolution, strange continuities emerged. In Portugal, the order was not destroyed, but transformed, renamed the Order of Christ. It retained property, personnel, and influence, operating with papal approval. Many former Templars simply changed insignia and continued their work. Scotland presents an even stranger case. At the time of the arrests, Scotland was excommunicated and beyond papal authority. This legal gap may have offered refuge. Later legends place Templars among Scottish forces, fighting under new banners, protected by political isolation. These examples suggest the order did not vanish everywhere. Instead, it adapted. Where persecution was unavoidable, it fragmented. Where protection existed, it endured under different names. Critics caution against overstating continuity, but institutional survival does not require formal acknowledgement. Skills, knowledge, and networks can persist quietly, passed down without records. The idea of rebranding aligns with Templar pragmatism: survival over martyrdom, silence over confrontation. If true, the Order's end was not an execution, but a transformation. This possibility reframes the mystery. Perhaps the Templars did not disappear because they were destroyed, but because they chose obscurity. In doing so, they slipped beyond history's reach, leaving behind fragments, symbols, and quiet traces that hint at survival rather than extinction. As centuries passed without a discovered hoard, some began to question the premise itself. What if the true treasure of the Knights Templar was never gold? What if it was knowledge, ideas, texts, or insights too valuable or dangerous to fall into hostile hands? Knowledge weighs nothing and leaves no trail. It can be carried, hidden, memorized, or encoded. If the Templars possessed information that challenged authority or belief, protecting it would matter more than protecting wealth. This theory aligns with the Order's behavior, their secrecy, their silence under accusation, their willingness to endure destruction without revealing what they knew. Gold can be surrendered. Knowledge cannot. Ancient texts, alternative histories, or theological interpretations could explain both the Church's fear and the Order's restraint. Such material, if real, would never be displayed or reclaimed publicly. Its power lies in absence. Critics argue this romanticizes the Templars, yet the Church's reaction suggests something more than financial threat. Institutions do not mobilize such force over money alone. If the treasure was knowledge, then its disappearance makes sense. It was never meant to be found. It was meant to survive quietly, passed selectively, hidden in plain sight, or lost intentionally. In that light, the greatest Templar treasure may still exist, not buried underground, but embedded in silence, waiting for a world ready to understand it. On a cold evening in March 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was led to a small island in the Seine. Bound to a stake, surrounded by clergy and royal officials, he was meant to die quietly. Another condemned heretic, erased by fire. Instead, he spoke. Witnesses recorded that de Molay rejected his forced confessions and proclaimed his innocence, declaring that the order had been wronged. Then came the words that would echo through history. As the flames rose, de Molay is said to have called upon God to judge those responsible for his death. He summoned Pope Clement V and King Philip to answer before divine justice within a year. It was not shouted in rage, but delivered with calm certainty, as if the outcome were already decided. Public executions were meant to demonstrate authority, not invite prophecy. Yet the crowd listened, unsettled. Curses were not uncommon in medieval Europe, but this one came from a man who had endured years of imprisonment without breaking. His composure lent weight to his words. Whether de Molay truly believed in divine retribution or simply sought moral vindication is impossible to know. But his final declaration transformed his death into something more than punishment. It became a challenge, and history, as it unfolded, would give those words a disturbing resonance that no one present that night could have anticipated. Within months of Jacques de Molay's execution, the seemingly impossible occurred. Pope Clement V fell ill and died suddenly, never fully recovering from the strain of the Templar affair. Shortly after, King Philip IV suffered a fatal stroke while hunting. Both men were gone within a year, exactly as de Molay's words had foretold. In medieval Europe, coincidence was rarely accepted at face value. The deaths sent shockwaves through courts and clergy alike. Rumors spread rapidly. The curse of the Templars had claimed its first victims. Fear replaced triumph. What had seemed like a decisive victory now felt dangerously incomplete. Skeptics argue that disease and stress explain the deaths. Life expectancy was low and rulers died often. Yet timing matters in how events are remembered. The precision of the prophecy transformed ordinary deaths into something symbolic. For many, the curse offered moral balance. The powerless had spoken and power had fallen. It reframed the narrative from righteous punishment to cosmic injustice corrected. Whether supernatural or psychological, the impact was real. The deaths marked the end of an era and cast a shadow over those who benefited from the Templars' destruction. What followed was not closure, but unease. The sense that something unresolved had been unleashed, and that consequences might extend far beyond those first two graves. As the story spread, the curse became legend. Chroniclers repeated it, preachers whispered it, the idea that divine judgment had followed the execution of the Templars unsettled Europe's conscience. What if the order had been innocent? What if God had taken sides? The narrative shifted. The Templars were no longer merely disgraced knights. They became tragic figures, victims of betrayal rather than villains of heresy. Fear replaced certainty. Even those who supported the trials grew uneasy, wondering whether justice had truly been served. This fear altered how the events were remembered. Accusations lost their sharpness. Stories emphasized suffering rather than guilt. The curse filled the gap left by unanswered questions, offering an explanation where evidence was lacking. Institutions thrive on control of narrative, but legends resist authority. The curse could not be tried, imprisoned, or erased. It lived in memory, shaping perception long after documents were sealed. Over time, the curse became inseparable from the Templars' legacy. It symbolized not revenge, but reckoning, a reminder that power does not guarantee righteousness, and that history has a way of revisiting unresolved wrongs. In that fear, the Templars found a strange form of vindication, surviving not through records, but through the unease they left behind. Whether one believes in curses or not, the story of Jacques de Molay's prophecy endures because it represents something deeper. It is a warning encoded in narrative form, a reminder that injustice, once committed, does not remain contained within its moment. The curse symbolizes unfinished justice. The trials were never resolved. The verdict was never clear. Innocence and guilt remained blurred. In that uncertainty, the curse offered moral clarity where institutions failed. Across centuries, the tale has been retold not as superstition, but as commentary. When power silences truth, consequences follow, if not immediately, then inevitably. The deaths of Philip and Clement became symbols of that belief. For modern audiences, the curse matters less as a supernatural claim and more as a historical metaphor. It captures the discomfort we feel when authority triumphs over evidence, when convenience overrides conscience. The Templar story refuses to rest because it was never properly concluded. The curse keeps it alive, reminding each generation that unresolved injustice lingers. It waits in memory, in legend, in archives reopened centuries too late. In that sense, the curse still functions, not as a threat, but as a question. What happens when truth is buried, and who eventually pays the price for silence? In recent decades, the Vatican has emphasized openness, announcing selective access to once restricted archives and presenting itself as a steward of transparency. Yet when it comes to the Knights Templar, that openness reaches a clear and deliberate limit. Large portions of material related to the order remain sealed, uncatalogued, or accessible only to a narrow circle of approved researchers. Official explanations cite preservation, misclassification, or irrelevance, but these reasons ring hollow to historians familiar with the archive's scope. Documents far older and more fragile have been released without issue. What distinguishes the Templars is not age, but sensitivity. Even after the Chinon Parchment came to light, expectations of fuller disclosure were unmet. Instead, the release felt controlled, almost surgical, enough to reshape the narrative, but not enough to expose its full context. Key correspondence, financial records, and internal deliberations remain out of reach. The selective transparency suggests calculation rather than caution. Institutions rarely hide material that confirms their righteousness. What remains sealed hints at contradictions still unresolved, details that complicate the story rather than clarify it. For modern observers, the silence is revealing. It implies that the Templar affair is not merely a medieval embarrassment, but a precedent with ongoing implications. Releasing everything would invite scrutiny, not just of the past, but of how authority manages truth. As long as records remain locked, suspicion persists. The archive doors may open symbolically, but for the Knights Templar, they remain firmly closed, guarding secrets the modern world is apparently still not meant to fully confront. For historians seeking answers, the Vatican archive can feel less like a repository and more like a maze. Scholars describe experiences marked by sudden denials, vague explanations, and access granted only to discover crucial files missing. The pattern is subtle, but consistent enough to raise concern. Requests that appear routine are delayed indefinitely. Permissions are revoked without notice. Entire collections referenced in older catalogs no longer appear where they should. No single incident proves obstruction, but together they form an unmistakable picture. Researchers often speak cautiously, aware that criticism can jeopardize future access. Still, many privately acknowledge encountering invisible walls, topics deemed sensitive trigger restrictions that defy clear policy. The Knights Templar remain one such topic. Some scholars report being redirected towards secondary material, summaries instead of originals. Others are told files were lost, misfiled, or never existed. These explanations mirror the same absences historians have noted for centuries. The effect is chilling. Academic inquiry depends on completeness. When records are fragmented, conclusions become speculative, and uncertainty favors institutional narratives. Silence becomes its own form of control. These obstacles are not dramatic, but they are effective. They ensure that no single researcher can reconstruct the full picture. Knowledge is dispersed, incomplete, and therefore manageable. In this way, modern scholarship echoes medieval secrecy. The methods have changed, but the result is familiar. The truth remains just beyond reach, hidden not behind locked doors, but behind procedures that quietly say no. At first glance, the fate of a medieval order may seem distant, even irrelevant, but the story of the Knights Templar continues to matter because it reveals how power responds when threatened. The mechanisms used against them did not disappear with the Middle Ages, they evolved. The Templars' destruction shows how institutions prioritize stability over truth. When faced with inconvenient facts, authority often chooses silence, delay, or distortion. These strategies remain recognizable in modern politics, religion, and governance. The persistence of secrecy surrounding the Templars suggests unresolved discomfort. It reflects an understanding that admitting past wrongdoing invites questions about present legitimacy. If authority was abused once, it can be abused again. This is why the story endures. It is not about treasure or curses, but accountability. The Templars challenge the comforting belief that history naturally corrects itself. Sometimes injustice is preserved deliberately, protected by time and complexity. Modern audiences sense this relevance instinctively. In an era of leaked documents and contested narratives, the Templar case feels familiar. It mirrors contemporary struggles over transparency, trust, and institutional memory. The unanswered questions force reflection. Who controls history? Who decides which truths are released and which remain buried? The Knights Templar serve as a case study in how narratives are shaped not by evidence alone, but by those with the power to decide what survives. That is why the silence still matters. It is not a relic, it is a warning. Archives are often imagined as neutral spaces, passive collections of the past. In reality, they are instruments of power. What is preserved, what is released, and what is withheld shapes how history is understood. Few institutions grasp this more clearly than the Vatican. By controlling access, the archive becomes more than a record. It becomes a filter. Truth is not denied outright. It is managed, contextualized, and delayed until its impact is minimal. This is a subtler form of authority, but no less effective. The Knights Templar exemplify this dynamic. Their story has been shaped as much by absence as by evidence. The archive does not lie. It simply remains silent at crucial moments. That silence directs interpretation. Control of history means control of legitimacy. Institutions rooted in continuity depend on stable narratives. Disruptive truths threaten that stability. Archives provide the means to contain disruption without confrontation. This is not unique to the Vatican, but the scale and longevity of its archive make it exceptional. Centuries of decisions compound, turning selective preservation into historical reality. For the Templars, this meant erasure without resolution. For modern society, it poses a broader challenge. If archives shape truth, then access is not an academic concern. It is a political one. The Vatican Archive stands as a reminder that history is not just discovered, it is governed. And those who control it wield influence far beyond the past, shaping how reality itself is remembered, interpreted, and ultimately understood by generations yet to come. After centuries of debate, every surviving piece of evidence surrounding the Knights Templar can now be laid out side by side. The accusations, the confessions, the missing records, the political pressures, and the hidden absolution all point in different directions. At first glance, the contradictions seem irreconcilable, but when examined together, a pattern begins to emerge. If the Templars were guilty of heresy, the evidence should be clear and consistent. Instead, it is fragmented, coerced, and unsupported by physical proof. If they were innocent, the scale and brutality of their destruction becomes impossible to justify through faith alone. This leaves a third possibility, one history often avoids because it is the most uncomfortable. The Templars may not have been destroyed for what they did, but for what they represented. An independent power structure, an organization beyond royal control, a body of knowledge and influence that threatened established hierarchies. In this light, guilt and innocence become secondary. Silence becomes the objective. The trials were not about truth, they were about resolution, about removing a problem without addressing its cause. Once the order was gone, the need for clarity disappeared with it. This reframing forces a difficult conclusion. The question was never whether the Templars were innocent or guilty. It was whether they could be allowed to exist. And history suggests that once that question was answered, everything else was arranged to justify the outcome, regardless of truth or consequence. The Vatican Archive holds no final answer to the Knights Templar mystery. Instead, it proves something far more revealing, that history is often shaped not by what is false, but by what is withheld. The Chinon Parchment did not resolve the debate. It exposed the machinery behind it. The file shows that truth and action can diverge completely within institutions of power. Innocence can be acknowledged privately while punishment proceeds publicly. Records can exist without consequence if they remain unseen. This realization reframes the entire story. The mystery is no longer centered on secret rituals or lost treasures. It centers on decision-making, on moments when leaders choose stability over justice and silence over correction. The archive reveals a system capable of holding two truths at once, one for internal record, one for public consumption. This duality is not accidental. It is structural, and it is shaped far more than the Templar case. What the file proves is not that the Church lied once, but that it understood the power of narrative. By controlling access, timing, and context, it shaped centuries of belief. The Templars' fate was sealed not by evidence, but by convenience. The archive does not redeem them, but it indicts the process that erased them. In that sense, the real mystery is not medieval, it is timeless. How many other truths remain intact, but invisible, preserved, yet powerless, waiting quietly while history moves forward as if they never existed? Historians are trained to analyze what survives, but in the case of the Knights Templar, what does not survive may matter more. The missing documents, the erased testimonies, the absent inventories all speak in a language of omission. Between the lines of official records lies a second narrative, one shaped by fear, pressure, and restraint. The gaps are not random. They align too neatly with moments of controversy, too consistently with threats to authority. Silence, in this context, is not emptiness. It is strategy. By leaving questions unanswered, institutions avoid accountability. Ambiguity becomes a shield. The Templar story forces us to read history differently, not as a complete record, but as a curated one. Every absence invites a question. Why was this not preserved? Who benefited from its disappearance? The truth between the lines is unsettling because it cannot be quoted or cited. It must be inferred. An inference threatens certainty. This is why the mystery endures, not because evidence is lacking, but because it is incomplete by design. The truth was not erased, it was fragmented. Understanding the Templars requires accepting that some answers were never meant to be given, that history can be shaped as much by what is not said as by what is proclaimed. In that silence, the past remains unresolved, and unresolved history has a way of resurfacing, demanding interpretation long after its witnesses are gone. The Knights Templar refused to fade because their story was never finished. It ended not with clarity, but with suppression, not with resolution, but with silence. That unfinished quality is what keeps the mystery alive. They haunt history because they expose a fragile truth, that institutions can survive by burying justice, that power can outlast truth if it controls memory, and that silence can be more effective than lies. The Templars challenge the idea that time naturally corrects injustice. Centuries passed before the Chinon Parchment emerged, and even then it changed nothing for those who suffered. Time preserved the institution, not the truth. This realization unsettles modern audiences because it feels familiar. The mechanisms have not changed. Only the context has. The story ends without answers because answers were never the goal. What remains is a warning. Some truths are buried not because they are false, but because they are dangerous. Dangerous to authority. Dangerous to legitimacy, dangerous to stability. The Vatican Archive does not close the case. It keeps it open, and that is why the Knights Templar still haunt history, not as warriors, bankers, or mystics, but as a reminder that truth, once silenced, does not disappear. It waits, quietly, patiently, for someone to notice what was left unsaid and ask why it was never meant to be heard.